collaboration with the Cyprus Mail. This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
Coming up this week, we'll talk about the Gaza flotilla after Israel hijacks a boat in international waters.
If Gaza is no longer occupied, then we have every right to sail into the port of Gaza. We've been asked by the Palestinians to come. And so Israel has no right to stop us. Either they have to admit that they are occupying 1.8 million people, and then they have to treat them kindly as an occupying force is supposed to, or they have to admit that they're no longer occupying and we have every right to sail in.
A conference is held on the Cyprus negotiations and possible changes to the way they're run.
I would like to see the process used whereby we work together to find solutions rather than both submitting separately proposals.
And animal rights activists demonstrate outside the presidential palace.
We want animal police. We need animal police. The local police cannot take care of this anymore. They don't know, they don't have the how-tos. A lot of them aren't even willing. They don't care enough to do something about it.
The Free Gaza Movement is a human rights group that was founded back in 2006. Their mission is to break the Israeli siege of Gaza. They have just, I'm sure if you follow the news, sent off another flotilla to see if they can break that siege. Greta Berlin is one of the organisers of the Freedom Flotilla. Greta, you've been involved with this movement pretty well from the start, I think.
Yes, actually, my friend Mary Hughes Thompson and me, Paula Rudy, and a couple of other young women from Australia were the original co-founders of the Free Gaza Movement clear back in September of 2006.
It's a very long time that this siege has been ongoing. Israel still insists that there is no siege, and yet if we look at what's happened to the people on the latest flotilla, one can only say, how can they say there's not a siege when they, I think, actually commandeered the Marianne, which was one of the lead boats in the last flotilla, and forced it to dock in a port it hadn't intended to go to?
Yes, actually what they did is they hijacked the boat, they kidnapped the passengers, they've stolen the boat, they've stolen all of the equipment, and they still have some of those passengers being held in prison in Israel. And you know why they hold them? They tell the passengers that they had entered Israel illegally, which of course is ridiculous considering the passengers had no intention of ever going to Israel. They were on their way to Gaza.
Well, and they were also taken, were they not, in international waters. Now, I'm really confused about the fact that global leaders are fighting piracy on the high seas, particularly off the Horn of Africa and places. And there are rules of the sea, which, if you're in international waters, I'm not really clear how, anyway, legally, any navy can force a civilian boat to go somewhere else.
Well, they can't, but nobody holds Israel accountable. Israel's been doing this from the moment that they rammed our Dignity, which was clear back in December of 2008, and they rammed it 3 times in the middle of the night in international waters as we were on our way to Gaza, and no one held them accountable. So between that ramming of the boat in 2008 and now, Israel has managed to capture 8 or 9 boats in international waters and flaunt international law and say to the world, we don't care what the law is, we're going to do what we want to. And this was 100 miles outside of Gaza, clearly in international waters.
What can your organisation do about this? I mean, have you thought about going to international courts, or is there a maritime court?
I'm not aware of one. I'm not an attorney, but I do know that Free Gaza is part of a suit that has been brought in front of the International Criminal Court, the ICC, because of the 10 murders on board the Mavi Marmara. In order to take this to a court, you have to have a country that is willing to do that. The Mavi Marmara was flagged in the Comoros Islands, which signed the Rome Statute with the ICC. Turkey has not signed that. The United States, Israel, those countries have never signed the ICC Rome Statute. So you have to be able to have a country that has already signed the statute that will take this to court. And it's still in court. Interestingly enough, the prosecutor at the ICC said, yes, she thought this is what Israel had done. It had committed war crimes. But it wasn't large enough to merit taking to the ICC.
You mean that there should have been more deaths for it to merit the ICC looking at it?
Yes, exactly. I don't know where you draw the line. We had 10. I don't know why you draw the line at 100, 1,000, 100,000. I'm not quite sure where she wants to draw the line. But a law firm in the UK has taken it up again and has asked her to look at it again. That is highly unusual at the ICC, because you have to remember that Palestine has also taken Israel to the ICC just in the last 2 or 3 weeks. So this is going to be very interesting to see what happens. Somewhere along the line, someone's going to hold Israel accountable.
Do you think that the way the Marianne this time round was handled, and the fact that I believe the Israeli Navy boarded the vessel and then forced it to dock in Ashdod, is that a different approach because of the fallout from that last tragic, the Mavi Mara?
No, they started boarding our boats and forcing them into Ashdod clear back in July of 2009. The Spirit of Humanity was boarded. People were roughed up, passengers were kicked around, and some of them were wounded, and the Spirit of Humanity was pulled into Ashdod. That was true with Freedom Flotilla 1, and it's been true of the many boats that have gone. There's been a Canadian boat that's gone, an Irish boat, a Jewish boat. This particular flotilla was the 15th voyage into Gaza.
Some of the early ones have actually reached Gaza.
Right, our first 5 trips we got into Gaza. We got into Gaza, nobody stopped us. We had already set a precedent that they had no right to stop us. You said something at the very beginning of the program, and I think it needs to be emphasized, and that is that Israel says Gaza is free. If Gaza is no longer occupied, then we have every right to sail into the port of Gaza. We've been asked by the Palestinians to come. And so Israel has no right to stop us. Either they have to admit that they are occupying 1.8 million people, and then they have to treat them kindly as an occupying force is supposed to, or they have to admit that they're no longer occupying and we have every right to sail in.
And that's the conundrum, isn't it? Because it does seem that there are double standards on this across the Western world.
Yes, there are not only double standards, but nobody's holding, even if somebody is going to take this to the UN, the United States is always going to veto any resolution. I don't remember the exact number of resolutions against Israel right now, but I think it's 70. And the United States has vetoed most of the last half dozen or dozen of those. So Israel sees that the big gorilla in the room, the United States, is going to protect them. So they're just going to do whatever they can get away with, and they are getting away with it.
Where do you go from here? I mean, so many voyages, so many flotillas, and since those early days, certainly, none have, well, I'm not sure I should say none have been successful, because one of the things I suppose they are doing is drawing attention to the situation. But none have reached their destination.
Right, none have reached the destination, but they are successful. And that's one of the reasons that we continue this. We continue to put Gaza on the front page, if not so much in the United States. It certainly has been true throughout the world that these are always covered. There's been a lot of coverage of the Marianne because what happened was the Israeli Navy came out and said that it was uneventful. Well, then, of course, we start seeing the videotapes where one nonviolent protester was tasered. They pulled the Marianne into port against its will. They arrested all the passengers. That's not uneventful. And every time that happens, it gives Israel yet another black eye. When we went the very first time, which was August of 2008, that's been, almost 7 years now, we made a promise to the Palestinians. We said that we would return until Gaza was free. And we've honored that commitment 15 times now. Just because we haven't gotten in doesn't mean that we are unsuccessful.
Who are the people who volunteer to go on these boats and, let's face it, with the history, possibly put their lives on the line?
Well, certainly on the first trip, there were 44 of us who got on those two ramshackle boats. I mean, they were pretty, they were old fishing boats. But our Greek partners had said to us, these are two old wooden boats, but you can't sink them. They're really very seaworthy. And they were absolutely correct. That was the case. That was really, I would say, the only voyage out of the 15 that had true activists on board. Most of us on those two boats had worked with the International Solidarity Movement. We had put our feet on the ground. We had worked in the occupied West Bank, or we had lived and worked in Gaza. And that was really the time that activists got on the boats and went. After that first trip, it has been a combination of people who would like to go, members of parliament, high-profile people. We're trying to get the media to pay attention. And they're not going to pay as much attention if somebody who's an activist gets on board as opposed to somebody like Nobel laureate Mairead Maguire gets on board. And we know that. So we try to use that to the advantage so that the media will cover it.
You also had a member of the Knesset, I think, on board, and the Tunisian president?
He's the ex-president of Tunisia, and we also had a member of the Knesset on board this time, and we also had Hanine Zawabi, who was also a member of the Knesset, and she was on board the flotilla in 2010 that was attacked.
So what's next, Greta? Do we expect another one in a year or so? Where do we go from here?
It's a very good question. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of money and a lot of time to do this. People are trying to organize from around the world, and that's not an easy thing to do between cultures and time zones. But you can imagine trying to make a phone call in Cyprus, for example, and you're calling Los Angeles, which is 10 hours behind you. They might as well be on the moon. So it becomes really difficult to do a lot of this. It's amazing that we have succeeded as well as we have. And I think that reason is just sheer determination that we're going to keep Israel's feet to the fire. They are not going to get away with this. And people need to recognize what is happening in Gaza. Do I think another one is going? Well, I read this morning that there's a Moroccan flotilla on the way. That's the first time I had read that this morning.
Is that under your auspices as Free Gaza?
No, and it doesn't need to be. We started it, but we certainly hope that we're not going to finish it. We are hoping that other countries, other initiatives, the Jewish Boat to Gaza, for example, wasn't part of Free Gaza. We will support anybody that wants to go. We will provide media help or anything else because we have a long history now of knowing how to do this. We would be thrilled if somebody else went.
And let's just finish, if we may, with telling people about your website, because I know that there are petitions there and a lot more information and presumably places to donate as well if anybody does want to support you. It's www.freegaza.org, and I think you have a Facebook page?
We have a Facebook page. It's just called Free Gaza Break the Siege. And we have another Facebook page which is called Freedom Sailors. We wrote a book. 24 of the 44 of us wrote a book called Freedom Sailors. And everything that is raised on that goes for projects in Gaza. And it's a great book. I mean, buy it on Amazon. You can download it onto your e-reader. It's lots of fun. It'll make you laugh. It'll make you cry. And you will read it and think, how on earth did they ever get there that first time? And it makes a great story of activist determination in the face of huge, huge difficulties.
Well, congratulations to all of those who presumably are still in Israel. Are they from the Marianne and will soon be, deported?
Well, the ex-Tunisian president has already been deported. I think that the two Canadians are in the process of being deported. So anybody who follows either Free Gaza on our Twitter account or follows it on Facebook, you'll see a yellow sail there, and it's a symbol of our determination to go. And so that yellow sail does not come down until all of those passengers are freed.
Greta Berlin from Free Gaza Movement, many thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for calling.
Keep up to date with events in Cyprus and around the world with the Cyprus News Digest.
The negotiations for a Cyprus settlement, of course, are ongoing, and there's great hope on the island that this time both the leaders seriously mean to do the business. At a conference earlier this week on how to get a win-win situation, Kostas Apostolidis, along with Mehmet Ali Talat, former Turkish Cypriot leader, and Alekos Markidis, who's a former advisor to Glafkos Kleridis and former Attorney General of Cyprus. They were all the speakers. Kostas, you deal particularly, in an academic sense as well, with conflict resolution and negotiations. What were you hoping this conference would achieve?
I'm hoping that the procedures will become more appropriate to a win-win situation. The traditional United Nations approach is to request positions from both sides. But the win-win approach, and both of the leaders have said that that is the purpose of the negotiation, win-win approach, is rather static and doesn't allow sufficient communication for people to work out proper solutions.
You spent some considerable time in the 90s not only working on negotiating committees on the Cyprus problem, but also as an advisor to some of the leaders. Now, have things changed? It does seem, as I said at the beginning, that these two leaders mean business, and we've thought this before and then very quickly been forced to realise that actually not a great deal has changed, and yet there does seem to be hope.
In my introduction, I said that the intractable problems of the world, and Cyprus is listed amongst them, are very difficult to solve, even with the best of goodwill. So you need the goodwill to have the hope and to have an attitude that facilitates a solution. But dealing with the actual problems is very difficult. For example, how do you deal with the biggest problem, which I think is one of the most difficult to deal with? That's the territorial adjustment. If there is no territorial adjustment, there is no solution. Finished. So there has to be territorial adjustment. Mr. Talat, when he was the leader, he actually accepted that. He also voted for the Annan plan, which had considerable territorial adjustment. So that's very brave. He's talking about something between 40 and 60,000 people moving home. That takes a lot of courage of any political leader. And it's not easy to do. So there's one thing to negotiate it, it's another thing to do it properly without having problems.
In actual fact, that's one of the things you brought up, but if we also look at the way the negotiating process is being carried out, we have the two negotiators, we have already in the first few months of Mustafa Akinçi's leadership, more meetings, I think, between the leaders of the two communities than we've had sometimes in a year in the past.
Well, don't forget they're both from Limassol, so they get on well and they're true to Limassol tradition, drink, song and the rest of it. So that's the easy part. But as Akinci said, we always have a good time together, but dealing with the negotiations is very difficult, and it's difficult because the reality is difficult. What are you going to do about the Turkish settlers? I mean, how is that going to be resolved? It's a difficult one.
It is, but it's one of the things that both leaders know they have to deal with, because you can't just say, well, we won't worry about various bits that are too difficult to think about.
No, but they say in English, the devil is in the detail. For example, say you agree to territorial adjustment, which is difficult to agree to in the first place. How do you implement it? I mean, are you going to go in the house, someone who's not willing to leave, are you going into his house and take him out with police? Are we going to have a police state in operation in order to implement? Very difficult things.
You obviously hoped, and there was a good discussion after all the speeches, you obviously are hoping that this will at least be food for thought, I think. What else will come of it?
Well, I would like to see the process used whereby we work together to find solutions rather than both submitting separate proposals. It's better if we work together and come up with common proposals if we can.
Well, Espen Barth Eide is relatively new to his job as the UN Secretary-General's Special Advisor here. He does seem to be facilitating as much as he can. What's his role in all of this? Should he just be there to help? Or you did mention that in the past the UN wanted people to put forward their ideas on UN proposals. Should the UN back off a bit?
Not necessarily. It's the way they should allow time for people to work the solutions out, and that's what's missing. And when I mentioned the Committee on Laws, that's exactly what the Committee on Laws did. It didn't apply the Harvard system, which I mentioned fully, or anything like that. But it allowed us to work together to find solutions, and we managed it. 112 laws. There was 95% agreement, and the agreement that was missing was only because the United Nations were in a hurry to finish, because they wanted everything completed before we entered the EU on 1st of May 2004.
And all those agreements of the past, do you know if they're still accepted as having been agreed? Because every time we get new leaders, we tend to say, OK, we better start again, and it never gets anywhere.
A lot of people, if you notice in the room as well, had no idea that these things had taken place. I mean, one of the agreements, which I mentioned, how the federal government would cooperate with two federated states to deal with European Union affairs, has been resolved. We made the agreement, we all agreed on it. So no one knows about it.
And that's the problem, isn't it? Nobody does actually know what's been agreed, and perhaps more basically, Kostas, how many people who will be voting in a referendum if a plan is agreed, how many of them actually know what a federal state is?
But, you know, a lot of people did read or tried to read the Annan plan. It was very difficult to read. It was very tricky. If it didn't actually mention it, it didn't include it. But it sometimes gave you the idea that it did, so it was rather difficult. But in the end, I realized that if it doesn't actually say something, then it wasn't in. So it was a very tricky document to understand. Not many people could understand it.
And people do need to understand it if they're going to vote on something.
Yes. They also need to know under what conditions, for example, they could live in a northern state, or the Turkish Cypriots in a southern federated state.
So it's the very basics of how it will affect people's lives as and when a plan is implemented after a referendum says yes.
That's right, because schooling, for example, which is crucial to most families, is a federated state function. It's not a federal function at all. So if you're living in the north, how is your children's education going to be dealt with? You need them to know Greek. Do you understand what I'm saying? So these are crucial issues. The health system, how would that work? The idea is the two systems will be separate. Maybe they will join one day, but they're far apart. Social insurance is even worse, the system in the north than in the south. So there are real problems there in bringing those together. The idea is to keep them separate until we get working together, and then try and deal with some of these difficult issues.
Well, there are a lot of them to deal with. Kostas Apostolidis, thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure, Rosie.
And while we're on the subject of the Cyprus negotiations, Turkish Cypriot leader Mustafa Akinci was in Brussels earlier this week, meeting with the President of the European Parliament, Martin Schulz. Afterwards, this is what he had to say.
We want this solution for our people. We don't want the continuation of the status quo. We want to create a better future for younger generations. As I have stated for many times, our generation and the elder generations, we have suffered a lot. We have shared the grievances, the bloodshed. Now it is high time that for the younger generations we create a better future. We have been outside of the international law for many, many years now. We want our community to be part and parcel of the European Union family. We want to be within the framework of international law and order.
Turkish Cypriot leader Mustafa Akinci in Brussels earlier this week.
You can subscribe to the Cyprus News Digest on iTunes for free and get the program downloaded to your phone or tablet so you can listen anytime, anywhere.
On Wednesday afternoon, a group of animal lovers gathered outside the presidential palace in Nicosia, demanding that action be taken by the government on animal abuse. Joining us on the programme today, we have Anna Stifler from the Nicosia Dog Shelter. Anna, what exactly were you hoping to achieve by this demonstration?
We are hoping to be heard because the government has been promising and nothing's happening. We've just got more abuse and more abuse going on. We see nothing happening about it, and we're hoping that with everyone coming to the demonstration that things are going to change.
There was the very well-publicised case of Billy, the dog in the cardboard crusher in Prodaras last year.
Yes.
And after that, the government did say that it was, I think it had meetings with some of the animal organisations here, and it did say that it was going to address these problems. What's happened since then?
We did have meetings with them, and they were promising us that a lot of things were going to change. But
what sort of things were they planning to change?
Well, we wanted, the fines for a change. Everything that happens in Cyprus for the animals is 85 euros. Anything. If you kill a dog, it's 85 euros. If you abandon a dog, it's 85 euros. Anything you do, it's 85 euros. So we're hoping to change that.
So you want much tougher sentencing?
Oh, for sure.
And what about the fact that so many cases don't even make it to court? The police do seem over the last 6 or 8 months to have prosecuted more people than we've heard about in the previous probably 10 years.
They prosecute them. They go that far. I mean, we have changed in the last 10 years. It's just that 2 months imprisonment for someone who was dragging a dog to death behind his car and is not a sentence. And this is why we're there today, because we really want to see these people stop doing it. By giving them 2 months, it's not going to change anything.
Apart from tougher sentences, what else are you looking for? I mean, is there anything that can be done in terms of the guidelines for owners of pets? Because we had that other case this last week of 17 dogs, many of whom starved to death.
He's a backyard breeder. We've been trying to stop them for years now. But again, we don't have laws to stop them. So there's nothing we can do. He is going to be taken to court, which is going to take another 5 years anyway. Just like Billy. We did all that for Billy, and it's going to go on. It's not going to change anything.
So what are you asking the government to do now?
Well, first of all, we want animal police. This is the number one thing we are there for today. We need animal police. The local police cannot take care of this anymore. They don't know, they don't have the how-tos. A lot of them aren't even willing. They don't care enough to do something about it. We call the police when we have a case, and there's a few police, there is a few people that really do care, and they'll come with us and see the case and take it all the way. There's other people that really don't care. They think they have much more serious things to do than speak with us about an animal cruelty case. So we are asking for animal police. We are asking for authorities that we will be able to speak with about these cases, and something will be done. And also, obviously, stricter laws.
What about educating people and perhaps going into the schools so that you could explain to young children the do's and don'ts when it comes to how you treat animals?
All the time. In Nicosia Dog Shelter, we have teachers in the shelter that are volunteering for the shelter, and they also volunteer and go to the schools and speak to children. A lot of organizations do it, not just the Nicosia Dog Shelter. So that far we've gone. But it's not just from the kids, really. We're very behind in Cyprus, and we have to stop them legally. Because, when they give them a fine of 85 euros or they take them to court and give them a 2-month sentence, it's nothing. It's nothing that's going to stop them from doing it.
Well, that's Anna Stifler from the Nicosia Dog Shelter talking there about the problems faced by animal welfare organisations here and the lack of proper follow-up in Cyprus when it comes to cases of animal abuse. Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.